The episode archive of Your Creative Push is now easier than ever to navigate. Head to yourcreativepush.com and click episodes at the top. There you'll see all the episodes listed by date and by genre. Every episode of YCP is meant to inspire you, regardless of your creative passion, but you can now easily find the ones that fit your creative medium when you need a little extra push. Your Creative Push, episode 236.
What works for you, and that deserves indulgence and respect.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is David Zinn. David is a freelance illustrator from Ann Arbor, Michigan. He's also a street artist who specializes in small-scale, improvised, and mostly lighthearted chalk art. This was one of the most relatable conversations that I've had, and pretty much everything that David said was gold. What I really loved about our conversation was his explanation of his fear of the blank canvas, and that's how his street art started, and how the blank canvas stops people like him because of the infinite possibilities that it offers, and how for him, he needs to constrain those possibilities in order to get started. He has to limit it. We talk about the art brain and the science brain, and how he's noticed that people are either more frightened of the idea of drawing from life or by the idea of drawing from imagination, and how there's nothing in between, and how that stops some people in their tracks because they see how talented other artists are, other artists that are doing something completely different than they are even interested in, and they just assume that they're not an artist because that artist is so capable of doing this thing that they're not even interested in. We talk about how his lighthearted subject matter typically comes to the surface because of the fact that he's having a bad day and he needs to fill a void in his own life, and so he just creates it. And perhaps one of the most interesting things that we talked about was the fact that he doesn't watch people's reaction to his street art and what all creative people can kind of take from this. Overall, it was one of my favorite conversations. I love listening back to this one. I felt so inspired as I was editing it, even though it didn't really need much editing. And there's also a special treat for Patreon supporters as well. So that's all I've got for you. Please enjoy my conversation with David Zinn. David, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here, man. I suppose the best place to kind of start out would be telling us how you first started in illustration and then got to your street art.
Well, the drawing itself, just being someone who draws stuff, which is a title I'm much more comfortable with than artist or illustrator.
Okay.
Compulsive Doodler is a label that my friends and family wish I wouldn't use because it makes it sound like a disease. But I've just always been, basically between us and other artists listening, a compulsive doodler. A lot of it was the result of shyness because it's a great way to avoid eye contact with other people. You can just sit and bury your head in a sketchbook, and then on one level, people can't talk to you, although I've realized over the years that the flip side of that is it makes some people very curious what you're doing, and then they do actually want to talk to you. So it's been a mixed bag from the beginning. And, I actually went to school for writing, probably on some scheme that I was going to be able to illustrate my own children's books. But in the end, people were asking me to draw stuff for them, and it was easier to say yes to them than to try to hack out a career based on my education. I think it's worth mentioning, and this is where I worry I might get into some long answers, so feel free to either cut me off or just edit this down behind my back.
No, go for it.
A lot of it, I think, has to do with a thing I talk about a lot now that I do all my drawing in public. I have a lot of conversations with people about art, especially with people who don't think of themselves as artists. And it often circles back to the fear of a blank canvas. That I think is the reason why a lot of people that I meet on the street who say, "Oh, I wish I was an artist. I wish I could draw." First of all, we always have a conversation about how at some point, at some age, they did draw, even if they've forgotten that. Because at some point you could hold a crayon and you hadn't learned how to write yet. So how else are you going to fill the many exciting hours of being an infant? But I think eventually people start to get to that point where they aren't happy with their own abilities, and that blank page becomes really intimidating. And a lot of the people I talk to seem to decide at some point, like, I must not be an artist, because artists clearly don't have this problem. Because in theory, a blank page or a blank canvas should be the most wonderful freedom and opportunity that everyone should long for. And yet, from what I've observed in my own life and talking to other people, it's actually the most paralyzing freedom you can ask for, where there's too many options, there's too much freedom, and there's too much fear, I think, in all of our heads, whether we're artists or presumably not artists, that maybe whatever we do to this blank page will not be an improvement over a blank page, that we'll regret the marks that we make and think, oh, I should have done, someone else was, I must not be able to draw. And my whole life, even as a compulsive doodler, has been trying to push past, convenient word, that fear, that way to feel like this blank page will be happy that I messed it up. And being a commercial artist, being a freelance illustrator, was a great way to avoid the blank page, because there was always a reason why you were drawing what you were drawing. You never had to face the challenge that I'm incredibly impressed most young artists face so willingly, of being given the freedom to create whatever you want, to just express your inner heart on this blank space. And it's terrifying to me. But if someone's putting on a show and it's Shakespeare, but it's also in space, and they need a poster that makes it clear to people that it's Shakespeare in space so they don't show up and get angry, now I've got something to work with. Now I've got some limitations on that freedom. And I find that infinitely more inspiring than the blank page. So the commercial stuff grew out of that. It was a relief when people started asking me to draw stuff, no matter how bizarre or mundane it was. It at least gave me, first of all, a paycheck in return for doing something I had a compulsion to do anyway, which seemed almost criminal. But also a reason why I was drawing what I was drawing, other than, a deep, scary contemplation of my artistic soul. So that maintained me for years and years and years. And I felt very lucky to have found a job that involved doing what I probably would have been doing on my day off. Except for that one thing that I think is a universal experience, that that your job is your job if there's something that you wish you could change about it.
Right.
Either when you do it, or who you do it for, or the building in which you do it, or, there's something that you would change if you could, but you can't because it's your job. And that was the boomerang effect of having this convenient, weaseling out of the blank canvas, is that some days you didn't want to be sitting at this desk drawing this thing, this widget, because the person who hired you needs this widget drawn and it needs to be done by 5, even though your inner child is just desperately bored by what's happening here and is trying to crawl its way out of your skull. This really is a long answer. I apologize.
Please.
But I think I am at least jumping through a lot of the preliminary stuff that explains what has happened to me. So I was working freelance as a professional illustrator, just doing small jobs around town in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is relevant because, as a freelancer, I was working at home and I was my own boss, and I was doing work which increasingly is all in a computer, which meant you were sitting in your house staring at a computer screen on beautiful summer days in Michigan, which are remarkable, in part for their, splendidness, but also for their rarity. And there comes a day where it just seems like a deathbed regret for you to sit staring at this computer on this beautiful day. And if you're your own boss, you technically have the freedom to not sit and stare at that computer on that beautiful day. It takes a lot of discipline to be a freelancer, especially a work-at-home freelancer, because you wake up in your office and no one's going to make you do that work that you have to do except you. But I think, I assume people who've had more conventional bosses would back me up in this. The best boss is not just a whip cracker. The best boss actually knows when to loosen the leash a little and use something other than the stick to make things happen. And luckily, my inner boss, who may have been my inner child masquerading as my inner boss at the time, said, "You know what? We're sitting at this desk. It's a beautiful day, but we're staring at this computer screen, and we're making a incredibly, strange, not really exciting piece of art that has to both serve the purposes of the project and make the client happy. And those two things are not always the same thing. And it has to be done by 8:00 on Friday morning. And we're feeling rushed, and we're not really feeling creativity, and it's not really working. So here's an idea. What if we went outside to brainstorm on the sidewalk?" Yeah. That's a good plan, because that's where the discipline can get some wiggle room. It would have been completely irresponsible to set this job aside and just go sit in a hammock. I knew that was wrong. I knew that would be the death of my career if I indulged feelings like that. But if I was making art, since I'm an artist, excuse. Yeah, technically anywhere I make art at any time, I'm technically doing my job in some way. So that was the total excuse for starting to draw on the street, was just sheer procrastination. It was the most irresponsible thing I ever did, which makes me a terrible role model for children and other artists, because I didn't get punished for it. Slowly but surely, that actually became clearly the thing the world wanted me to do, much more than my strong, dedicated effort to make myself useful to society. And so I started doing that more and doing illustration less. And now I have no time for doing useful illustration because I spent all my time drawing on the sidewalk. And the reason I brought up the blank canvas, see, I told you this was a long answer, is because the thing I didn't realize when I was just looking for an excuse to be outside is that the sidewalk is not a blank canvas. The sidewalk is actually covered with all kinds of specks and marks and streaks and cracks and things. And if you stare at it for any length of time, your brain will show you things that need to be drawn on it. It is just as blissfully limiting in other ways as well, but it's in its non-blankness as commercial art was. You have all these weird little things that you would have to either be part of the drawing or they're going to be in the way of the drawing. Plus, it's going to get dark in a few hours. Plus, you're using Crayola, so you better not get too full of yourself about the fancy art you're making, because you're crawling on the ground using children's toys, and it's going to wash away in the rain. So you might as well just create whatever's going to make you happy right now, because that's really the only stakes that you're trying to live up to. Okay, so that's the long and sadly the shortest version I have for the answer to that question.
Well, I love it. There's so many good things about your answer too. And just a couple points I wanted to make was the idea of like not necessarily. I think people can take like really great advice from this is to not define yourself as, an artist, a painter, a musician, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. It's someone who likes to draw stuff, somebody who likes to dabble, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like a creative person, and to not define yourself so that you can kind of go for those, when your inner child is your inner boss, and you can kind of go towards those whims, to go outside and, see what kind of inspiration you can find from the sidewalk, and to remember, like you said, that you won't get punished for it. I think that's really important, is the fact that you can just explore those things, and it might not immediately lead to a new career or more money or anything like that, but the fact that you won't get punished for chasing those kind of whims.
You make a very good point, and I'm relieved, because I worry this is one of my more controversial, though semantic beliefs, that I'm on a campaign to hopefully get people to stop using the word artist as a career designation. And to a lesser degree, to stop using scientist as a career designation, although I think that makes my point, because very few people, when you ask them what they do, will say, I'm a scientist. Mm-hmm. Because there's always a word for what they do other than scientist. I'm a molecular biologist, I'm an engineer, that's your job. And the same, I think, is equally true of art. If you are a profession, if your job is being an artist, there's a name for what you do to make money or as your career. You're an illustrator, you're a graphic designer, you're a dancer, you're a musician. There's all these different kinds of art. And to be an art, and the reason I think this gets under my skin and the reason I make a fuss about it is because of these conversations I keep having with people who clearly see being an artist as being an other. It's this thing that is way over there that only some people do, and they clearly have some weird thing going on with them that they do it. Which I just don't think, I don't think it's helpful. It doesn't really always feel all that good to be labeled as some kind of freak because of what you do, even if it's in the kindest way. But I also think it's not accurate. Everyone has, I believe, an art brain and a science brain that they use in some way unavoidably in their daily life. And that's a completely separate thing from whether they actually have that as their job or even as their hobby. And if we can stop labeling artist as this monumental thing, we can get into the specifics, both of the specific joy of what people do when art is their job, and the art things people do in their daily life that don't count as their job, or maybe even as their hobby. I mean, technically, anytime you draw a mustache on a magazine picture of a person who doesn't have a mustache, you are using your art brain in a way that people don't think of as art, but it's still on the same spectrum. And I think that's an unacknowledged important part of what makes us so successful as a species, is our art brain and our science brain. And people don't really see the former, or maybe sometimes the latter.
Yeah, man, well put. And I think that part of the problem also is the idea of definitions. I talk about this all the time, is, going to college and then getting a job, and then that being the definition of what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And to be dabbling in like an artistic venture is like defying that definition, and it's going to like somehow decay the thing that you're doing as your kind of career. But it's actually like, it's like another part of yourself, is that kind of creative impulse that I think we all have when we're kids. Like, we're all born with it, and it's just a matter of like, I guess, kind of when it goes away, like when it dies. So like, why do you think that certain people, do you think it's because of that, because of them defining themselves as like some other thing, and they can't have this hobby? Or do you think it's comes from kind of like what you were talking about before, like that fear of the blank canvas, where they're like, either I'm not going to be able to say what I want to say, or somebody said this before, or I'm going to be afraid of what I'm going to say with this complete freedom, or some combination of all those things?
Well, it's definitely a combination. I think part of it is this societal thing I feel I've observed of artist being a specialized thing that most people don't have a right to do, which I think is broken down by the acknowledgement that we all did it at some point when we were young enough, and without any self-doubt. So clearly, part of what draws people away from feeling like they have a right to be an artist is something that happens to us as we're growing older. And I think it's something that is well-intentioned. We stop being tiny tyrants who have complete confidence that whatever we want to do at any given moment is clearly the right thing to do, including drawing on every surface we can get our hands on, no matter how much trouble we're going to get into. But, it's healthy that almost all of us eventually reach a phase where we think about our actions in terms of other people. And we actually consider the effect of our actions, but we also compare what we can do. We think of what we can do in terms of how other people do the same thing, which I'm sure is good for society. I mean, it's part of what helps us work together, is acknowledging like, that hitting people in the head with a hammer is not what other people are doing, and the people I do it to don't seem to like it, so I should probably stop. But I think
it's not cool, David.
Not cool.
Don't hit people in the head with a hammer.
And luckily, most of us learned this lesson.
Yeah.
But I think because it's just a blanket, transition we make, drawing is one place in particular where I think it has an unintended negative side effect, that you might be perfectly happy with what you can draw until you reach an age to compare what you can draw to what this other person can draw. And the worst part about it, to my mind, as I've interviewed people against their will about this, is it's not necessarily about quality. It's not that what they can draw is better. It's that it's different. And it's different in a way which too many of us are persuaded to think is better, or must be, even aside from better, is art. The weirdest thing I run into, and maybe people who've gone to school for this will say they already know this really well. This is something that always worries me about talking about art, because maybe there's an Art 101 class that explains something I think is my own personal revelation. So I apologize in advance if that's the case. But, I end up, talking to a lot of people about why they don't think of themselves as artists, or whether they think of that. because I keep getting all these people coming up to me in public and saying, oh, I wish I could draw, and we end up having a conversation about it. And I have noticed that everyone I talk to, whether they're an artist or whether they think they're not an artist, is either more frightened and stressed out by the idea of drawing something while looking at it, or by the idea of drawing something while not looking at it. And no one is in the middle. I've never met anyone who is on the fence whether they prefer to draw from life or draw from their imagination. And it doesn't even seem to be about which one they enjoy more. It's about which one they fear more. And I feel this pretty keenly because I am terrible at drawing from life. I tried it for years. I make myself go to figure drawing classes and just stare at that elbow and try to draw that elbow. And no matter how much effort I put into it, it always looks like an elbow, but not that elbow. And it makes me crazy. And under other circumstances, I could very easily use that as justification for the belief that I am not meant to be an artist, because an artist would be able to draw that elbow. And if you cannot connect your eye with your hand well enough to reproduce what you're looking at, how could you possibly think of yourself as an artist? And yet, I've heard both that story from other people, which is reassuring because it means I'm not alone. But I've also talked to people who spend their entire childhood being able to perfectly reproduce anything they looked at. Portraits of their family, motorcycles, cars, the pet next door, anything. But then they got old enough to sit in art class and sit next to a kid who could just make up crazy, wild, fantastical dragons out of their imagination without looking at anything. And they said, and I think I'm quoting this almost verbatim, and I figure, well, I'm just copying what's there. I can't make stuff up. So clearly, being able to make stuff up is what makes you an artist, and I must not be an artist because I can't do that. So it's a weird case of envying what you don't have. Of thinking that, not only just envying it, but thinking that what you don't have must be the thing that would be legitimate. And what you can do and what makes you happy must not be art. And I think that's where a lot of people fall off the map of having faith in their own art, is not respecting the fact that what works for you. And that deserves indulgence and respect.
Yeah, where does that come from? That grass is always greener mentality, because it's true. Like, you could have the best skills in one particular area of art, kind of like we were talking about, the definition, like all of the different types of art there is, and then you could be like a master at that, yet you look, like you said, you look at somebody else that does something completely different, something that you'd probably almost never even attempt to do anyway, and just be like, oh, that's it, like, I give up. Like, where does that come from, and how do you get over that comparison?
I think there's maybe a couple of pieces, at least, that come to mind. One, I think it's the curse of being the type of animal we are, that one human being is a pretty useless thing. Plunk one of us down in the middle of the woods with no other human beings, and the odds would not be good for survival. So we survive by collaboration. And part of collaboration is comparison and, the whole working together thing we were talking about a minute ago. And that's going to have some pitfalls of not working quite right. Again, I think part of it is this strange belief that your art has to be the primary thing in your life in order for you to do it, which is as if it has to consume you, or else you have no business messing with it at all, which is strange, because I think that's even almost more specific to visual art than other art. There's a guy here in my hometown who is a brilliant comic artist and does a lot of service in the community by doing a lot of teaching, has whole comic art camps for kids and festivals and things. And he also gives individual lessons. And I was sitting down with him once, and he told me this thing. It never occurred to me. He said, yeah, I was having this drawing lesson with this kid, and it was going really well. And then when it was over, his mom came into the room, and she said, well, I mean, this is great and all. He's not going to grow up to be a professional artist, right? And the amazing thing was, there are parents all over the world making their kids take piano lessons. And I bet you almost none of them expect their kid to grow up to be a professional concert pianist. So where's the difference there? In the case of piano lessons, we've accepted that it's just something that's good for your brain. Maybe because music is more mathematical, or maybe it's just that we've agreed that piano lessons are a good form of torture for young children to break their spirit. I don't know. But we don't have the same attitude towards being able to doodle. Even though, and I wish I had the science to throw in at this point, but I'm sure there is science out there that doodling helps your brain. That people who even just jot meaningless little shapes on a piece of paper while they're making decisions make better decisions. Because it's part of your head. Just like having, even if you never play music after the age of 8, you've still got that structure in your brain that was created by your parents forcing you to play the piano. And it's useful. I can't necessarily show you a map of how it's useful, but I would bet my soul that it is. And the same is true of doodling. But for some reason, we don't put those in the same category, and I cannot tell you why, but I am hoping to change it.
Yeah, I think you are too. Well, kind of getting to your work, and we're talking about subject matter now. Mm-hmm. Your subject matter is very fun and playful and innocent. Has it always been like that, or is that something that you kind of developed over time?
Well, I have never particularly tried to guide what comes out on the street, in part because of the process I've already described. It's a lot like playing Connect the Dots, except you have an infinite number of dots. You could also think of it like a Rorschach test, that I draw what looks like it wants to be there. And it's a little awkward to admit, especially if you're trying to feel like a serious artist, that apparently what I see is pretty damn cute. And you don't really get much respect as an artist for going cute. It's not something people consider edgy or serious or... So on many levels, I think that's the main thing that proves that I'm not an artist, that clearly I just want to fill the world with happy, cute creatures. The thing that a lot of people, probably for their benefit, never find out is that the reason I believe that I keep drawing these cute things is I'm usually having a bad day. And the first time I went out, I was having a bad day. I already told you all about it. And many other times, it's because I'm actually not a very upbeat person in many respects. My mother used to call me Eeyore, and I endorsed that nickname wholeheartedly. So the best explanation I can think of when people want to know why I keep drawing these cute, happy little creatures is I am putting out into the world what I wish was in the world because I am needing them. They are there to cheer me up because I need cheering up. The fact that they seem to cheer other people up is just sheer luck on my part, because I'm getting credit for trying to cheer up the whole world, and the whole world was not on my mind when I drew that creature. It was just me. Right. And the fact that I wanted something cheerful to look at under my feet. So, yeah, that's, I think, where they come from. And I do worry, because art always evolves and builds on itself. Maybe the day is coming where the cute's going to run dry. And at that point, I might be in a difficult professional situation where my artist soul might be yearning to draw a character shooting up heroin in an alleyway, but I'm pretty sure I should not do that unless I can somehow completely separate it from my own professional reputation. But, if you examine how art tends to evolve in someone's head and in their hand, it's not inconceivable that these things change. So I'm just hoping that I'll continue to actually have bad enough days that I need cheering up, because that seems to be the key to the current success.
An interesting thing to hope for, but...
Well, I am Eeyore, so...
No, I love it, though, and I love that it kind of fills a need for you, and I think that's the whole purpose of art or pursuing your kind of creative passion, is to kind of fill that, I don't want to say void, to help as like a self-therapy in a way. And it also helps other people too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few lessons to be learned, I think, potentially in the experience. And one is, that the power of art in your own life, whether it's your job or your hobby or just the thing you do while your hands are feeling itchy on the phone, is to leave the world different than the way you found it. To actually take steps. I think that's why toddlers are so enthusiastic about it, because it's that first thing you learn to do where you don't have to just accept what's around you. You can make it different, which is a huge power to have. to be able to actually make things different than the way you found them. Even if it's just the doodle on the napkin on the bar while you're having dinner. That's massive power to have. And yeah, it's a way, and that also boomerangs back that in changing the world, you can change. In fact, I would argue you can't help but change yourself in the process. That doodle on that napkin did something to you in the process of doodling it. And also it goes in the other direction, that if you leave that napkin behind, someone's going to find it. And even if you make no effort to share that art with the world, just by leaving it behind, you may never find out what happened to it. It may go straight into the trash, but chances are someone saw it on the way to the trash, and it had an effect on them too. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, how charming. They might have thought, oh, damn artist messing with the napkins. But still, that's an effect. You can't deny it. And so just if you focus on what's going to make you feel okay, in my experience, that will have a ripple effect, even if you're not trying to make a single ripple in the world.
I couldn't agree more. And to make your point exactly, like you are a shining example of that, because you don't watch people's reactions, right?
Nope.
When you're done?
No, it makes a difference in a few ways. One that I'm sometimes reminded of is if I hang around too long, I'm guaranteed to see someone stand on the face of one of my creatures while making a cell phone call. And not out of cruelty or rudeness, but just because they don't see it.
Right.
Because they're on the ground, and people, apparently a surprising number of people don't have to look at the ground while they walk, and I'm very impressed with those people.
It's very, very talented.
Yeah, it's an amazing talent. But there's also the matter of the experience that these people have with these drawings. And I'm sure this carries over to other forms of art, that even if it was a painting in a gallery, if the artist is standing right next to that painting, you're going to react to that painting differently, because they're right there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's both because you aren't going to say, oh, this is terrible. What kind of lunatic monkey put this together? Not just about that, but that you are now experiencing this art in terms of this is a thing that this person made. And the ideal experience I hope for people that see my art, even though I'm very grateful to social media and the internet for sharing these things so far away from the sidewalk where they were drawn, is for someone to accidentally stumble across one of these drawings. Someone who, like me, does need to look at the ground while they walk, who might, like me, not be having a great day, and suddenly be confronted with this completely random experience that on its surface makes no sense, because no sane person would spend the amount of time that I've taken to put this strange tiny creature on this space where a dog will eventually pee. It's so random and so irrational and so pointless that I hope it creates this brief moment of wondering if this was done specifically for them. That this is not a piece of art that you're supposed to appreciate like you'd appreciate art in the proper way of reading the plaque on the wall and then going, yes, I see, and then having no, this is just here for you because you were in the right place at the right time to see this. And tomorrow it's probably going to rain and it'll be gone. So take from that what you want. And maybe you hate it. Maybe you like it. But you are free to do with it whatever you want. And I think that's important.
Yeah. It reminds me of... I'm Mr. Rogers is kind of one of my heroes.
That's a good choice.
I remember reading about how his father used to just put pennies around the city, like on the sidewalk. And Mr. Rogers asked his dad, like, why do you do that? And his answer was, because I like to imagine their reaction when they pick it up. And it reminds me of what you do.
I've never heard that. That is genius.
And I love that idea. And I think people can really take a lot from that, especially because, you're not always going to have that direct interaction with your audience, especially if you do put your work out on the internet, and to kind of have that faith and that trust that the exact reaction that you want your audience to have, that someone will have that, or that it's already happening, and to really assume that that's going to happen, because you're not always going to be able to see it. And if you think too much about the reactions, you don't always get that gratification of seeing how they react in like a very candid atmosphere. So just to assume that it's going to happen, and then just have that be the end of your worries, and then just be able to like kind of walk away from it mentally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a very good point, that the more expectation you put in to the interaction your art will have with an audience, the more you're limiting what will be a happy result. I mean, if you have a very specific point you want to make with your art, if you are really determined that people take a specific thing out of your art, odds are you will at some point be disappointed. Because what I feel is true in observing how my art works and how other people's art works, it's actually kind of the opposite of having psychic powers. The real magic trick that I've observed in making a drawing and just throwing in stuff, that maybe means something to me, but the magic of it is someone can look at a photograph that I've put online and they can take something out of that picture, which I did not put in, that is completely nothing like what was in my head. And yet it was created by that art, that art can provoke these things. And it's why, I think that's why people keep asking me if I've written a children's story using these characters yet, and why I feel uncomfortable with that when people say it. Because I suspect the reason they think these characters would make such a good story is because they've come up with a story in their own heads looking at these characters, because they look like they are in the middle of a story. And I'm sure the story in their own heads is 100 times better than any story I could tell them, and yet I am getting credit for that story that they came up with. It's yet another way in which I feel like I'm getting away with murder. Because, of course they like the story. It's their story.
Right.
And I, in most cases, as an example of this, I usually take this one picture around when I visit schools so I can make them understand this point. I was drawing at a festival somewhere. Lots of people on the street, very crowded, which is not an ideal circumstance for a street artist, because you're going to get stepped on if you're not careful, because you're working in the lower inches of space.
Sure. And people don't look down.
Right, and people don't look down. So the first concern was, how am I going to avoid being kicked in the head here? So the only reason the drawing happened where it happened was because it was right next to a lamppost, and I figured if people aren't going to bump into the lamppost, they're also going to probably not bump into me, as long as I stick close to this lamppost.
Well played.
Right? Yeah. See, I learned a few things after a few times getting kicked in the head. And then, which I had the visual here, but I think I can describe it well enough. Then it was about playing the connect the dots game, and there was a weird stain on the sidewalk that, as I stared at it, kind of looked like a big eyeball, just a big bulgy eye. So I drew a big bulgy eye. And at that point, it would have been weird to stop and go home, because it was a tiny drawing and because it made no sense. It was just a big bulgy eye on the ground. And so I had to draw some creature for whom this was its eye, and a little dragon-y type head, and then another eye, and then a head, and then the whole thing curves around the lamppost just to make sure I kept in the safe space where I wouldn't get kicked in the head. And it ended up being this weird shaped dragon that, because of that first stain, was looking very intently at a blank space on the ground, which was dissatisfying. Because I knew looking at it, I knew other people like, why is he staring? And they'd be like looking really like, what is he looking at? What? It was, So I drew a small mouse standing exactly where the dragon was looking. And I gave the mouse a sword because I felt bad for him, because I put him right inches away from this huge, terrifying dragon. And that is the full story, the full explanation of why that drawing turned out the way he did. It was just not getting kicked in the head, stain that looked like an eyeball, feeling bad for the mouse. And yet I can show that photograph to any bunch of kids. And not only will they be absolutely certain that this is an illustration from a story, and not only can they tell me what the story is, they will tell me several different stories, all of which they're sure are the reason why this drawing was made. And that is in no way true. And yet the stories are marvelous. I mean, you'll get about 75% of the kids you show this picture, you're like, yes, it's obviously a picture of a brave mouse fighting an evil dragon. But you'll get about a quarter of them saying, no, this is a story about an evil mouse who's trying to kill a baby dragon. Because being me, it's a pretty cute dragon.
Right. And
one kid, who I hope writes the great American novel, said, I think this is a story about a mouse who is a dentist. Blew my mind away. And that was all, that's that reverse psychic powers. I had none of those thoughts in my head. And yet the art was able to make them happen in other people's heads. I love it.
Yeah, and that kind of, I love that story. It really illustrates how to kind of battle the blank page like you were talking about. So what about for artists that aren't necessarily going to go on the street? They're not going to find that one thing that's going to like start them on their, journey of creating a piece from their imagination, especially for the planners out there that need to have everything planned out. How would you suggest that somebody that's literally going to use a blank canvas to kind of start to make that first mark and to start to create that piece?
That is a good point. Because I have to remember periodically that we're all very different in the way we approach art, and what works for me isn't necessarily going to work for everybody. Just like the whole drawing what you see versus drawing something from your imagination. I have a lot of trouble understanding people who would rather do a very technical, carefully planned drawing. And yet for some people, clearly that's what makes them happy. But, the best advice I could think of, trying to reach beyond my own experience, is both literally and metaphorically to continue to find ways, whatever ways work for you, to limit, if not destroy, the blank canvas. In literal terms, the way my brother and I used to do it when we were kids was we would play the doodle battle, which I now call Scribble and Swap because it's a more illustrative name, where you each have a blank piece of paper and you have no idea what you want to draw. So you make an completely insane random mark on the page and then you hand it to the other guy. And the reason you don't worry about what you're going to draw is because all of your energy is focused on trying to ruin that piece of paper so no one could possibly make anything out of this completely insane scribble. But then the satisfaction is now you have something to play off of. Now you have the challenge, like, no, I can totally make something out of this scribble. Tooth, 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 eye. Yeah, we're all done. It looks great. And obviously, that's not going to necessarily be what I recommend for a serious artist who actually has a canvas, though I wouldn't say it doesn't help to close your eyes and just throw something up. But I think it works metaphorically as well as literally to find ways to make that canvas not blank as quickly and as certainly as possible. Whether it's, like I said about commercial art, having some limiting factor. That yes, I get to draw this, but it has to serve this purpose. Or a limiting time, or a limiting, material. I think one of the reasons that I really only started making art that I would call art for art's sake when I started drawing with chalk was because you can buy chalk anywhere for pennies. You could even make it yourself. You could use a burned stick if you had to. And so for me, the intimidation that I was wasting expensive art supplies because I didn't know what I was doing just disappeared because it didn't matter. So for me, it was about removing that. I have an actual blank canvas in my studio, which I haven't touched in 23 years because I've never had an idea good enough to put on that canvas that would be worth not only, the cost, but also the annoying. I have to wash the brushes afterwards and the paint. I have to make sure I use the expensive paint. And all that shuts me down. Now, that's just me. That's not everybody. But if anyone is dealing with the same kind of thing, maybe you find an outlet where you don't have that worry about what this is going to cost. Or in my case, where you can be lazy enough that you don't have to wash anything except your hands when you get home because you were just drawing with a burned stick. So I think it's all about looking for those outlets while also understanding, from the way you phrased it, that people that haven't found their thing yet, that from what I've observed and what I've experienced, you don't find your thing finds you. And when you look back on it, it's going to seem almost like bad writing of your biography, how obviously your thing found you. There's parts of my life that, if I ever saw them in a biography about myself, I'd say, that wouldn't have happened. That's ridiculous. That's just too obvious. That, the example I can think of actually is that when I was in college, in my junior year, living in an old dormitory, because I figured the next time I would be able to have a living situation where I didn't have to clean a bathroom or buy groceries would be when I went senile and they put me in a home. So I was still living in the dormitory in this old building with a terrible, useless chalkboard on the door where no one could leave me any messages because you couldn't write anything on this terrible piece of slate. So I went, actually, I don't think I even went to the store. I was already at the store, huge box store, and realized that someone makes chalkboard surface contact paper. I figured, this is awesome. goodbye. Chalkboard, yeah. And I took it back to the dorm and I cut a tiny piece. And now people could leave me messages on this chalkboard, which was only about 14 inches wide. And I had a lot of chalkboard contact paper left over. And I was living in a dorm room. I didn't have space to store anything. So it covered the whole door. What else are you going to do? Had this shiny black chalkboard door that you could draw anything on. And not only could I draw anything on it, anything I drew on it was immediately public. And anybody could draw anything they wanted to on that door, and it could be immediately public. And in retrospect, that is a painfully obvious foreshadowing for what I finally ended up doing with my life. But that was, 30 years ago. That was a long time ago, and chalk did not come into my life in any serious way until relatively recently. But if you look back on it, that was my thing finding me, because I happened to find weird contact paper in the store.
I love that story, and I think that that's true for a lot of people that I've talked to, and myself included. It's those kinds of hints from the universe, as I like to say, like these kind of winks from the universe saying, maybe, hey, like nudging you in the right direction. And it's like trying to always keep your eyes open and not keep your eyes on the ground or on your phone. It's like looking around and trying to think about these things. Think about what direction you're being pushed to, because that's kind of what you are,
Yeah. And it does seem, especially, given the nature of your whole mission here, it should be reassuring that pushing is actually something that's going to happen whether you like it or not. As far as I can figure, looking back and trying to figure out how I ended up where I am, there are the things I did deliberately with a specified intent and hopeful result that may or may not have gotten that result. There are the things which I did, but not necessarily for the result that I got, like just wanting to fix my chalkboard on my door. And there are things that just happened to me that I had no control over. And all of these things have an equal power to decide where you end up. You might have a plan to be a world-class athlete and then break your ankle just stepping off the curb. And now all of your plans have changed just because of that one random thing. Now, it might also be true that the person who catches you when you step off the curb and break your ankle turns out to be very important in your life, maybe far more important than that athletic career would have been. So something is going to happen to you today, whether you like it or not. Speaking as an Eeyore, that's exactly the attitude I take to it. But the reassuring thing is that, if you're feeling paralyzed with decision making, you should probably ease off on yourself, because it's not really entirely up to you in a way that should be reassuring. Sure, you can push as hard as you want to get to that place, but be prepared that maybe the universe has other plans for you that you might like even better. If you just keep your expectations open, just like we were talking about before. The narrower your expectations, the more things you can be disappointed in the outcome. And the wider your expectations, the more things you can think, that's totally within the bounds of what I was hoping would happen.
Wise words, my friend.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to try to remember those myself next time I go all Eeyore.
Well, it's recorded now forever,
okay,
so
good.
You can come back and listen.
Yeah, I'll have to come back and play this for myself.
David, before we let you go, it's time for what I call the final push. And this is where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today, and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their own creative passions.
Oh, man, that's a lot of pressure. All right, let me grab a shoulder here. Okay, I feel like we already touched on some of it, so
good.
That's going to make it harder to make this sound inspiring now. I might ask you to loop back. But I'm going to give the most depressing advice I've been able to imagine for myself, just to switch things up.
Okay.
Which is the understanding, very difficult understanding, that every step you take in any direction towards anything is a step away from everything else, which is terrible, least inspiring advice you could possibly get. But there's a second part to it, which is that life is not a game of statues. You could obsess about what I just said, and then you're going to end exactly where you started, having been afraid to take a single step. And believe me, I am an Eeyore. I am a very down person, I know what I'm talking about. My knee-jerk reaction to everything is, do I have to?
Right.
But life is about taking those steps, knowing that, yeah, you are walking towards a thing and you're walking away from things. But like I said a moment ago, you're also being pushed in directions you aren't even planning to go. And as long as you are moving, you are succeeding in life.
David, man, thank you so much for coming on the show today and for giving us that push, man.
No, thanks for letting me yammer.
Of course, man. We really appreciate it. You can find David on his website, which is zinnart.com, zinnart.com. On Instagram, he is David Zinn. On Facebook, David Zinn Illustration. On Twitter, David Zinn_art. And on Tumblr, he is Sluggo on the street. We didn't even talk about Sluggo, man.
That's going to confuse people. Well, he's out there. He has his own Facebook page, too. So you can dig him.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll link all of that up then at the show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/David Zinn. David, thanks again.
No, thank you.
Oh, man. I had such a tough time making the show notes page for this, where I put the bullet points of what each guest says and then some of their quotes. But for this one, I just wanted to type literally everything he said verbatim because everything he said was really so great. Perhaps the most profound thing that he mentioned, though, was the idea of stop comparing yourself to other people and not envying what you can't do. It's appreciating what you can do and then going down that path and ignoring the completely different things that other people are doing with their art or their creativity. Because what they can do is art, but it's not your art. You might have tried to dabble in what they do and just found yourself hitting a wall, not being able to even come close to what they do. And that's fine. Appreciate what they can do, knowing how hard it is, but also know that they probably can't do what you do. Appreciate what you do have. Appreciate what you're able to get done. And stop assuming that because you can't do what they can do, that you're not an artist. And I love how he was saying how he gets credit for cheering up the whole world, but how he was only trying to cheer himself up with his art. And that is really what it's all about. It's trying to cheer yourself up or trying to fill a void in your own life with your creative passion, to fill in those gaps of your world and to put the things into the world that don't exist that you wish did. And then the beautiful thing is that other people will relate to them because we're all pretty similar and we all go through the same things. And by filling your own voids, you'll fill other people's voids as well. Voids that they might not even realize that they had. I mean, that's the whole reason that this podcast exists, because I needed something like it for my own creativity, but it didn't exist. So I made it. And guess what? Other people need it too. So the more inward you go, the more that you fill that void, the more you'll get into those situations where someone will look or listen or feel your artwork in some way. And like David was saying, assume for a moment that it was made specifically for them because you just touched that void within you that also exists within them that they didn't even know existed within them. So really, my thanks again to David for coming on the show. Such a pleasure speaking with him, and I can't wait to get him back on the show for another profound episode maybe. But if you didn't get enough and you're a Patreon supporter, definitely head to the Patreon page to check out the bonus content. I kept David on the line for a little bit longer to talk about how he deals with the weather, and he let me in on the definition of two of his favorite words that he didn't get to say on the episode, pareidolia and anamorphosis, both having to do with what he does with his street art. We also talk about how he shakes his fist at the sun. Just a really fun conversation I had with him after the episode. So if you want to check that out, you can head to yourcreativepush.com/Patreon. And on Thursday's show, we have Zarya Foreman. Zarya is an artist who does these breathtaking, large-scale compositions of melting glaciers. You might have seen her TED Talk, or you might have seen her art in House of Cards, or you might have seen it at Banksy's Dismaland. Just super realistic, breathtaking pieces. You can check out her work at zaryaforeman.com, or on Instagram, she is Zarya Lynn. Or you can head to today's show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/236 to get links to her stuff as well as everything we talked about today. But that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done, so go and get it done, and we will be here for you on Thursday if you need that push again. I love you all. Go, continue to get some amazing work done, and we will see you next time. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.